Hello, welcome. This is the fourth in my series of introductions to Marxism and the second of my discussions of class. What I'm talking about today is how class and class struggle operate in the world today. Now, according to Marx, modern capitalist society is more and more divided into two main classes, the bourgeoisie or capitalists and the proletariat or workers. He made this statement in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto, but I would argue that it is more true today than when he wrote it. In 1848, it applied only really to a corner of northwestern Europe and maybe a bit of the United States. Today, it applies right across the world. We have a global ruling capitalist class, albeit divided into different national sections, and we have a global working class. Everywhere, really, everywhere in the world today, both those classes exist and both those classes dominate the society. Now, most of my life, I have heard pundits and not a few social scientists, or people who claim to be social scientists, saying that class had disappeared, was in the process of disappearing, or was of declining importance. This was often based on the fact that the trappings of class from, say, the Victorian or Edwardian era, the top hats and the bowler hats and the upstairs, downstairs world and so on of the aristocracy, that had declined. But this is not the point. The reality is that class divisions and class inequality are absolutely as strong today as they ever were, and they affect people right across every aspect of their lives. For example, class has an enormous impact on health and life expectancy, the most basic things. In America, if you are from the top of the social scale, you will live roughly 10 years longer than if you're from the bottom of the social scale. In Britain, the figures are, again, approximately the same. And that will be the case with national variations everywhere. That the top people at the top of the scale will quite simply live longer. They'll have lower rates of infant mortality, less illness, and live longer. It affects educational achievement. This is not just a question of private education versus state education. Even within state education, those from the higher ranks in the social scale, the higher classes, will do better on average than those from the working class and those from the lower end of the social spectrum. Not in every case, there are exceptions, but on average they will do better. It affects your conditions at work, how you are treated at work, what rights you've got at work, what kind of conditions you work in. It affects your political behaviour, how people vote. It affects their culture. It affects everything. If you are a woman and suffered, therefore, from sexism, from discrimination, from the gender gap, from sexual violence, and all these things, you suffer them more intensely and sometimes in different ways if you're a working class woman than if you're a middle or upper class woman. The middle and upper class women suffer from them too, but it is different if you're a working class woman. Same if you're black and you suffer from racism. You suffer it more intensely if you're working class. If you are a working class black teenager in the United States, not only are you more likely to be incarcerated and shot than a white teenager, but you're also more likely to be incarcerated and shot by the police than if you're a black middle class or upper class teenager. Class continues to operate. Now, in the last session, the first session on class, I said that for Marx, class was rooted in the social relations of production, and in particular in relations of production that were exploitative. How does this work where capitalists and workers are concerned? Right. According to the dominant view, the relationship between capitalist and worker is essentially one of free and fair exchange. The employer offers the worker a wage. In return, the worker offers them their labour power. It's a voluntary contract. Now, Marx showed, basis of great length actually, he really delved into this. Marx showed that this was in reality neither a free nor a fair exchange. In the first place, it was not free because the worker, you as a worker, had no choice but to enter into this deal because the only alternative was either starvation or miserable poverty. Secondly, it was not a fair or equal exchange because in reality, and as a rule, the value of the goods and services that your labour produces is more than the wage that your employer pays you, and that difference is appropriated by the employer and becomes the basis of the employer's profits. Now think about it a minute. From the point of view of employers, that's the whole point of employing workers. They don't employ workers for the good of their health. They employ workers because they will make a profit out of their labour, and as soon as they cease making a profit out of their labour, they let them go, as they say, or often with, they say how much they regret it, but nevertheless they let them go. And therefore, in this relationship, there is a built-in conflict of interest. The lower your wages and the longer your hours of work, the more profit the employer makes on the deal, and vice versa. The higher your wages and the more you can limit your hours of work, the more their profits are decreased. So there's a real conflict of interest there, and this conflict of interests underlies the whole trade union struggle, which pervades the whole history of capitalism, and it develops wherever there is capitalist industry in the world, which, as I say, is now virtually everywhere. But the class struggle is not just about the conflict of interests in the workplace, even though that's its foundation. It's not limited to that. On the contrary, it extends right across the society. On every issue of public interest, there is a conflict of interest between the capitalist class and the working class. On the questions of health and education that I've mentioned before, do you want more spending on health and education or less spending? What kind of spending do you want on health and education? Different interests of the capitalist class and the working class. On foreign policy, do you want a foreign policy and war? Do you want a foreign policy that pursues the interests of imperialism and war? Or do you want a foreign policy based on peace and the cooperation of ordinary people? Do you want a foreign policy that involves going to the Middle East to fight a war for oil, or are you opposed to that? That's actually a class conflict. The former policy is the policy of the capitalist class. The second policy is the policy of the working class. It affects profoundly responses to things like the COVID crisis that we're in at the moment as I make this video, and the response to the climate crisis. The capitalist class has a vested interest in maintaining production even when it puts everybody's lives at stake, and so on, and is not really very bothered about producing necessary PPEs and protective equipment for people. On climate change, they have a vested interest in the maintenance of fossil fuels, even though they threaten the whole survival of the human species. Of course, the ideologists and politicians of capitalism systematically deny this. They never say, we are operating for the interests of the capitalist class. What they always say is that they are serving the national interest, the people as a whole. But in reality, that is a smokescreen, a mask behind which what they really do is pursue their class interests. Now, the final point I want to make in relation to class in this discussion is regards a criticism that is often levelled at Marx and Marxism, both in the academic world and sometimes on the left. And that is that because Marxism privileges, as they say, or prioritizes the question of class, that therefore Marxism has neglected or downplayed other forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, various other forms of bigotry. Now, I want to say that I think that is a mistake, and it misses a crucial point. And the crucial point is that racism, sexism, all those forms of bigotry and oppression are actually weapons in the class war. They are weapons that are used by the capitalist class in order to create scapegoats and deflect working class anger, and in order to divide the working class. And that therefore Marxists, whose fundamental goal is to unite the working class and focus its anger on the 1%, the capitalist class, have to be the most absolute opponents of racism, sexism, and every form of bigotry and oppression. So far from neglecting them, it is a crucial consequence of this focus on class struggle that they need to be opposed, and opposed absolutely and vehemently. I shall return to these questions, the specific questions of oppression, later in this series. I just conclude by saying that what Marx said 172 years ago in the Communist Manifesto is not only true for the world today, that we're divided into capitalists and workers, bourgeois and proletarians, but that the struggle between them has now become an existential struggle for the survival of the human race. Thank you.